Okay, let's get started with panel 3. So this panel is charged with talking about what your goals and your incentives are when you're communicating. And what we've heard the word incentive during the other 2 panels. I think what I'd really like to do now is drill down a little bit further. We have panelists who represent a lot of different parts of the communications ecosystem, and I'd like to hear from each of you what your specific goals and incentives are when you or your colleagues in that particular sector are communicating. And maybe, get personal, give some examples if you can. And we'll start, let's start down at the far end with...
Sure. So I want to tell a story because it's an example of a thing where none of all of us know that everybody has conflicting goals, and sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. But I want to give a story of one particular one that made it all really clear. So we recently did a big study with, I'm debating how specific to get, a PI in a large West Coast university on secondary cardio events. So right now, if somebody has a cardiovascular event of some kind, they're treated incredibly aggressively. It doesn't matter, even though only about 10% of them will go on to have a second event at some point, but they treat everybody the same, and it's really expensive, and everybody's scared to death. And so we thought maybe we can figure out at the level of proteins, figure out what differences would be found that would say this person needs to be treated, this person doesn't, aggressively. And so thousands of samples from 2 different places, thousands of proteins and thousands of samples. We found this amazing signature. It was published. And the time came to put together some news about it because it's pretty cool. If you can tell who's going to have a heart attack and who's not, it's pretty amazing to the degree that you could do this. And so all of a sudden, we ran into a series of mixed goals and incentives. So the PI wanted, of course, the recognition, well-established cardiologist, wanted, to get the next grant in based on these data, and so it was really interesting getting it out. The PI's institution, of which there were 2 main players. One was the Public Information Office, who, of course, wanted, all the attention to this because they, just needed, I guess, more stuff sent their way. But their TTO was also really involved in terms of IP and land grab and how we structured this thing. The institution that provided the backup samples, the validation samples, insisted that they should have at least top, if not equal billing, because if it hadn't been for our samples, you wouldn't have validated this. So, and the PI at that place was very interested in getting this in because they wanted tenure, and they wanted to have this publication in JAMA on their resume. At this point, no one had said anything about making life better for patients, and then we had to weigh in and say, what did we want? And I realized how silly what we wanted was. We wanted people to recognize that our technology did this. It sounds mundane, but it's like driving up to someone with the hood open and saying, look at the engine, and said, where's this car going to take you? And so, but ours was driven by investor pressure. Board of directors always wants a thing on the front page of the New York Times, which I told them we could do every day, but they wouldn't like the story that would appear necessarily. And then ultimately, we all sat down as a group, had this insane conference call, and thought, why are we doing this? This is really about how you can make a difference in a lot of people's lives, and who cares whose name is on it. And it actually made some progress, except with the TTO, with their lawyers. But it was interesting to get it all out on the table and think about, what are we about here? Why do we really need to have this? And we always have a mix of these kind of things that happen, and actually addressing them outright made a huge difference in how the coverage was eventually tailored.
So I'm going to tell a little story about my one of my other activities, which is as the chair of the Public Information Committee at the American Society for Cell Biology. So the PIC committee, their purview for years has been to facilitate the communication about cell biology to a general audience. It used to be very top-down. And when I took over the committee last year, partly because of my goals, but also because of some changes in the thinking more broadly, we decided to take a different approach and to facilitate our membership in their science communication skills, to help them better their science communication skills. And we're in the process of developing a set of toolkits to make available to our members and pretty much to anybody who wants to look at our website. And the reason I bring this up is actually in contradiction to a statement that was made on the earlier panel that the strategic communication of science should be primarily in the hands of those who are good at it. And I think that to some extent, I'm not disagreeing with that, but I think that all scientists can be better at communicating science, and especially about communicating their own science. And it's not just in these higher realms of journalism, but it's in the things that the previous panel were talking about, what Matt was talking about, going to your church, going to one of the things that we promote, that we're promoting is going to things like the Rotary Club, if you have a Rotary Club, or going to events that are in your community, and making an opportunity for yourself to garner enthusiasm about science. And so that really is the goal that I want to emphasize. It's not just about promoting your own work. It's about saying science is cool, science is interesting, we do this for a reason, we want people to be interested in it, we want to evoke support on a broader level for the whole process of science, on what we do, why it's interesting, why we do what we do. And we think that a distributed model where everybody can participate in this activity, some people obviously are going to do it better than others, but everybody can learn to do it better. Everybody can learn the skills to really go out and, as one of the previous panelists mentioned, it is a little bit of marketing. You want to generate enthusiasm. You don't necessarily want to say we're going to solve all these problems, but you want to say we're looking at these problems and we're trying to understand this puzzle, and this is why we think it's interesting, and this is the benefit that we think we can eventually get to.
Jocelyn, tell us your incentives when you...
and they may be a little different from what scientists' incentives are. I mean, my job, I'm a news reporter, so my job is to produce news stories, and I want to produce stories that people will read. And unfortunately, sometimes that means things like sexy goldfish. I mean, your editor is going to make you change your story to make it as accessible as possible. And we are judged these days by how many hits our stories get. We get weekly reports about which stories got the most hits. And sometimes those are important, in-depth science stories, but sometimes they're things like, having a cute animal story. And so, and sometimes as a reporter, it's a little confusing exactly what your employer wants. Do they want you to write cute animal stories or stories with sex in the headline because those get a lot of hits? Or do they want in-depth reporting on some basic research area that's important but hard to make accessible to the public? So those are some of the things that, yeah, Erica's smiling. She was a reporter.
Go ahead, Erica, and maybe you can also address whether there are any conflicts between the incentives that you have as a journalist and what you're teaching your students.
I was actually going to speak to the level of conflicting incentives that I experienced as a journalist, because I do think that, Ivan was bringing up the situations on the previous panels about where journalists and other participants in this process, where our incentives can collide. And, I think we do need to acknowledge that that happens and explore why it happens. So I was going to talk about some of the hardest times that I experienced that when I was at Nature. And I would be writing a story about somebody who was accused of misconduct or some kind of wrongdoing. And I can think of a lot of specific examples where the incentives are just completely run in opposing directions. So, for the researcher, of course, they don't want information about this to get out about them, because that is really harmful to their careers. Often the institution also is lining up that way, and the funder. But then you look at the other participants in that process. So that researcher's students might be really harmed by suppression of this. I think, the broader scientific community, how does it affect them when we're sort of not able to question or inquire about these cases? And then for me as a journalist, these were always some of the hardest cases to write about, because this is where you feel the most pressure to get things right. You take it really seriously if you're going to be, writing about something that could have an impact on somebody's career. That probably, the university legal team is going to come after you, and so you're going to need to make sure that you get things more right than you even normally would. And so for me, that always came down to feeling like even if individual scientists or funding agencies or universities really didn't like that I was doing this, I felt that it was good for science and for society that we recognize or at least engage in public processes that I think would ultimately improve the practice of science. And I think the people who I feel really grateful to for never kind of questioning my belief in that was my publication. So, Nature and my editors were always really supportive of absolutely, yes. And, if this is something that's important to improve the overall practice of science as a whole, it is worth investigating.
Anthony?
Real quick response to Lee's observation, and I just want to clarify. I completely agree with what you're saying, that I think striving for helping all scientists become enhancing their communication, whether it's intra-science communication or external communication, is obviously a wonderful thing from a normative standpoint. I think my comment came more from considering kind of the extreme version of that statement, which is, quote, expecting all scientists to be better communicators, particularly when it comes to external public engagement. We start getting into that area of how do we change T&P to make sure, and that makes me scared, because again, all scientists don't become scientists because they really want to be good communicators, right? So we have to be careful there, but I do completely agree with what you're saying. Getting back, I'll talk a little bit about incentives and goals. I'd love to share some good news with you relative to scientists' incentives for science communication. Based on the survey work that I've done and a lot of my colleagues have done over the years with scientists, we see lots of wonderful gratifications being reported in that work from scientists who do engage and have that experience, being gratified and thinking that it's legitimately helping to improve society, that it's fulfilling a sense of duty that they have, that it's fulfilling or contributing to their overall sense of morality. And this is a really interesting too. A lot of the scientists that we survey report that their activity with public engagement helps improve their own science, right? That to me seems like a really big one. Helps improve the quality of their research, their ability to talk about that research to different types of audiences, and ultimately can enhance their professional reputation as well. So that's always an interesting that pops out quite commonly across the data. Relative to goals, I talked a little bit about that in the last panel, but I'll just throw another thing out there. That one useful tool, as I would argue that any public engagement effort coming from a scientist would start with the identification of clear goals and communication objectives. And that comes out of something called a logic model, which some of you are probably familiar with, and I think is quite applicable in this situation. So your communication starts with identifying long-term goals, shorter-term goals, and importantly, then your tactics. Often I think when we talk about public engagement, we rush to tactics. I want to go to a science cafe. I want to start tweeting, right? Devoid of that broader context of, well, why are you doing that? What's the short-term and long-term goal? Is that the right type of tactic, depending on what long-term goal you have? And so, these different types of, we call them, modalities or types of engagement, they provide what we call different types of affordances, different strengths and weaknesses. And so being aware of what those affordances are is crucial relative to you being able to potentially achieve the goals that you have for your engagement efforts.
So I can give a case study, but this really focuses on goals. And number one, you have to know your audience. If you don't know your audience, no matter what your goal is, you're not going to be successful. So at Georgia Tech, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the laser-like focus on increasing industry research contracts. So that's what we wanted to do. So why? Well, we didn't know that federal funding is going to be around forever. We wanted to diversify the portfolio, wanted to make sure we had a lot of different revenue sources, wanted to be able to have a broader impact with the expertise that we have. So how did we get there? Well, we first started with our own research. We talked to industry. We went out, we looked at all of the different research that we had going on campus. And we took those thousands of areas and boiled them down to 12, which wasn't controversial on campus at all. Actually, I had somebody from the math department say, how come math isn't one of our core research areas? I said, because it's part of every research area, and IBM's not going to come to us and say, I need help with math. We talked to our own researchers who were doing industry work. We talked to industry companies that were already working with us. And the hardest part was talking to companies that didn't do a whole lot of work with us. Maybe they were interacting on one level with students or something like that, but they weren't doing hardcore research. There were no big contracts there. So what we learned is where the pain points were. If we don't know what some of the roadblocks are, then no matter what message we send out there, it's pointless. So one of the things we learned is that universities are perceived as being slow. We don't operate at the pace of industry. So industry isn't necessarily going to knock on the door and say, hey, I need you to help with this new invention that we want to roll out, but we're having this problem, that, and the other. We want to do it next week. They see semesters, they see students, they see red tape, they see issues. They think we can't keep secrets. So, yeah, you'll sign an NDA, but if you're doing work for this soft drink company, or you're going to go and take a contract from this soft drink company, and if it's the same people doing the work, isn't that a problem? And the other is it's just too complicated. The contracting is complicated. It's not kind of clear-cut like federal contracting is. Everything is a little bit different depending on what company you're working with and who those people are. So we learned all of that. So we knew the customer. Then it was trying to figure out on this gigantic campus, how do we tell stories in a way that would resonate with this audience, in a way that would get them to come to us if they weren't already engaging with us. So let's take energy as an example. How do we figure out in every college and school on campus who's doing work in energy? And it was spread across the entire campus. Well, you have to have the infrastructure to be able to do that. And it took years to be able to put this together. But having institutes on campus, some virtual, some brick and mortar, that took a look at research areas like a strategic energy institute that was able to put its arms around all of the academic units and all of the professors and say, this is all the work that's going on, and when General Electric calls and they say this is their problem, I'll put the right people around the table, and we'll have a broader conversation about how we can help. And they could also put their arms around all of the activities so that when we went and said we want to do a cover story for our magazine and a big feature on the website about energy research at Georgia Tech, we were able to do that. And it was a broad look at everything that was going on from a very high level, but interesting enough that if somebody saw something they liked, they'd be able to engage. And we were able to use that to in all of our different research areas to drive more people in, to encourage more conversations. And in my last conversation with the executive vice president of research, he said it's growing like crazy now. So that's setting goals and knowing your audience.
So to follow up a bit on this and from some of the rest of you, I'd like to return for a moment to the sexy goldfish. And that is both in industry, in academia, when you issue press releases or when you publicize things, do you have evidence that these are working? Any of you who want to jump in?
It's something I always wonder about. I mean, as a reporter, I'm getting the press releases, and you get so many, and you only will follow up on a very small number of them. And I assume that the people writing them are tracking how many stories come out of it.
So I'm not a press release fan because I just think they're kind of a waste of time now for that very reason. And a lot of places pick them up and then repackage them as the news, which can create its own problems with press releases. So like hits, I was kind of stunned actually, Jocelyn, when you said that the editors give you a list of hits. I'm like, what does that mean even? It just means somebody clicked on that link. Whether they opened it up, whether they comprehended it or not, we just don't know. So the sense is, especially in this kind of new fragmented world of social media and stuff, that they're not hugely effective, and you've got to start doing much more targeted kind of stuff. But people still put them out. Harvard Medical School puts out 3 or 4 a day, as far as I can tell, and I'm not sure how effective that actually is, or why they even do it. But my sense is they're not hugely effective, and there's not a really good metric for it, except how many kind of clicks you can get, or the other thing they talk about is how many impressions. Which means if something appears on a website, that's an impression. Well, you could be pretty much anywhere at that point, and if that counts, wow, So there's no good metric right now.
So I actually want to bring up a kind of a negative result of the sexy goldfish story. Part of my lab works on cancer, and when we publish something and they do the press release, I then afterwards get a deluge of phone calls from patients who want me to cure their cancer, and it's really uncomfortable and really awkward, and B, it's not good overall because it's raised this false hope that we can't address, and so I've had this conversation with our PR people to make them aware of the backside of these sort of overinflated press releases. And I mean, I think there's absolutely nothing good that has come out of that situation. I mean, any sort of exposure has had a negative effect on the people who've read it, on me, on the university. I think in general that, the negative ramifications need to be part of the conversation as well.
I think setting realistic expectations too. To that point, meeting with the researchers in advance and saying, here are the pros and cons. This is what could happen. That's something that we did a lot of. But as far as getting placements and getting attention, we would have a story on a robot that debones chickens, going down an assembly line. Well, that's not going to be front page news on a major national newspaper. But if we got it in Meat and Poultry magazine, that's $1 million placement. I mean, that's the best. And the researchers were super excited about that. And it was one thing that I think as communicators, we have to train our higher ups to understand. It's getting it in front of the right audience, because you can get it in front of 1 million of the wrong people and there'll be zero result. but one placement in Aviation Week or one placement in Meat and Poultry Magazine. And that's all it takes to generate some sort of return for that effort. So setting the expectations and kind of educating people that don't be disappointed because it doesn't hit front page of the Times.
But you don't need a press release to do that. You actually have to have a much more targeted kind of approach, don't you? I mean, you have to know who those reporters are. You go and tip rather than pitch.
It is. It's focus. Focus and targeting.
Let me ask you all to see if you can address the question of how we can communicate, reach just the right level of excitement without going over the edge to hype, such that you don't risk misinterpretation. In other words, how do you hit just the right balance? Can we start with our reporters, Jocelyn and Erica, perhaps?
Well, I guess, as reporters, we if it's a single study we're writing about, we start with the paper and the press release. And, if it has caveats in there, we'll pay attention to them. So I think that's an important part of what scientists need to do, both in the press release and make sure the press release writer includes them, and also, you probably do this anyway, but in the discussion section of your paper.
Yeah, one reason that I love covering science is that scientists are the first people to tell you about the limitations of whatever they're doing. They will always be the people who will volunteer, these are the reasons why, there might be XYZ problem with this, and this is the limits of what we're trying to say, and here are some people you can talk to who agree with me, and here's some people who don't. So, I think in my experience, scientists are pretty, when you actually talk to them about their own work, they are pretty authentic. And again, it goes back to that authenticity. So I think if I can actually get to, the real person who did the research, that's a huge help. And, also a lot of it is down to my job and Jocelyn's job or my student's job as a journalist, right? It's your job to contextualize information that you're getting. And, you need to go out and ground truth what they say.
One thing that I think has been really effective for us, we don't have the tyranny of having to have publications for tenure and grants. So we can actually say, what are we doing next? What are the things that we need to be done? So many stories end with more studies are needed. Well, that's such crap. Of course more studies are needed. What studies? What are you doing? And it gets people's interest, and they start to follow you and say, okay, where's that at? Where's this at? And I actually really like the freedom to do that. And I wish it was more freedom to do that because of the fears of, having your publications rejected or whatever. So,
Anthony, from the point of view of somebody who does research in this area, is there something that you can add about how to strike the right balance between engaging, exciting, and not over-hyping?
I'm afraid I don't have any sort of grand epiphany to share with this, but I will make an observation related to how we started off today, which strikes me that this notion of telling a good story, a good narrative that provides context of the science and of the research, what we call in academia a thematic reporting, seems like a win-win in this regard. That story, if told well, is much more likely to transport or connect with an audience member, someone engaging with that content. And that by telling that story and conveying that context, it's more likely that any sort of hype will A, be limited, or B, be obvious. Again, this relies, of course, on skilled journalists to be able to do that. We could go down a rabbit hole talking about that. I'm afraid I don't know of any easy answer other than really good writing skill.
Does anybody else want to add to that? Go ahead.
Especially in a university setting, and especially at a public university, making sure that there you're writing a piece and you've done one interview or you've read one paper, but once you're done writing it, the researcher should see. You think that that happens all the time. I don't know that that happens everywhere all the time. At Georgia Tech, we had a checklist that we went through. After that first review, it went on to compliance. And did they actually cross all the T's and dot all the I's? And are they legally compliant? Or is somebody going to raise their hand and go, oh, they didn't get that approval from such and such. That's not on file. That could create another problem. And then if it's sponsored research, there are, most of the time, the sponsor has to review it too. So, with those checks in place, that really helps. Where you run into trouble is when you circumvent that. You try to overblow something and then push it through without having those other eyes on it. And yes, sometimes stories get watered down in the process. Sometimes some of the excitement is taken out of it, but what we get at the end is something that's accurate, still pretty good, but accurate. And that's really important. And the other thing is ask the right questions when you're talking to researchers. And there's a story that I did with somebody who was studying ants. And just the fact that they were studying ants wasn't necessarily an exciting thing. But when I started asking questions, so how did you get into this? She goes, well, I used to be a high school teacher. I went, okay, this is interesting. How did you go from being a high school teacher to being a college professor? Scientist who teaches. She goes, maybe I'll become a scientist who teaches. So that really is the interesting part of the story. So asking the right questions and having that interaction where you pull out those little nuggets that might not ordinarily, come out in a paper, that really helps.
Add one quick little point, actually following up on a couple of the previous points. I think the one of the keys is to figure out where the appropriate locus for the enthusiasm should be. It shouldn't necessarily be on this single finding that is perhaps not as revolutionary as we, the scientists, think that it is, but maybe it's on something peripheral to that story. Maybe it's on the scientist's story, the ant lady, as opposed to Ant-Man, or maybe it's on what the next step is. I mean, I think that there should be enthusiasm. I mean, I think that that's actually one of the key issues on this whole topic is how to find that balance between enthusiasm and overhyping. But maybe the enthusiasm should be placed more on something slightly to the side, similar to what Erica was saying earlier this morning.
So a corollary to the balance question, I think, is how do you communicate uncertainty? If something is exciting, but how do you convey that and still have a good, interesting story?
I wouldn't call it uncertainty necessarily. You can write a story, and as we've talked about, you can talk about the limitations of what of the research itself. This is an exciting discovery. It's gotten us to this point. This is what we're going to do next. It's not the silver bullet, but it could lead us to one. And I think just being honest and realistic in what you write, as opposed to saying, now let's talk about the uncertainty of the research. That really feeds into the opposite narrative. So we don't necessarily have to call it that. I mean, within the scientific community, we know that. But I think as you're writing something that is for more general or public consumption, we can write that into our pieces.
I think it could. I don't mind uncertainty because I don't see it as a negative term in a sense. It could. What's exciting is this could mean this. It could also mean this, or it could mean this. And there's an excitement in how do you sort out what of those things does it mean? I think if you come in and say, this is going to be this or nothing, that's not so good. But it's better to say, this opens up this entirely new set of questions. And that's what makes science so compelling and such a great human enterprise. And that's the stuff we tend to lack. We want to have a nice, neat narrative, and it just never progresses quite that way. And so I don't mind uncertainty, but maybe that's not the right word. We should just say variability.
Yeah, just to echo that, I think of science not as providing answers, but of just generating more and more questions, right, fundamentally. And so the notion of uncertainty being an inherently bad thing is one that I think needs to be reflected on a little bit. There is also, I'll just point out, a really lovely literature focused specifically on communicating uncertainty within the context of science and on communicating risk within the context of science. That's not my area of expertise, but many a book has been written about that topic. And so some of you, for example, may have heard, and this is particularly relevant relative to the way climate change has been covered, about the notion of false balance, where kind of this news norm that's been around forever, this notion if you give, scientist source A or scientist A shares their opinion, and then scientist B shares the counter opinion, and you move on through the story, false balance. In some situations, that's less of a problem. The argument that was made, I think, in the academic and well, just more broadly relative to climate change was that false balance news norm completely falls apart within that context, and you need something different, which we refer to as the weight of evidence, where the journalist makes really clear the percentage or the lion's share where the lion's share of scientists actually lie on that particular issue, and that goes a long way toward helping an audience kind of understand and be able to make, interpret better the kind of complexities or the uncertainties associated with that issue.
Maybe another question that's related to this has to do with, as science communicators, the importance of trust that your audience has in you, and how do you assure that they're going to trust what you say or what you write? Any takers on that one?
I have a lot of conflicting thoughts about this. This is something that we're going to be studying. But I think when I think about the issue of trust, I guess my mind is sort of going beyond this room, and we've really focused a lot today on this discussion of how science journalists and scientists and professional science communicators can do a better job. And I guess I just want to acknowledge that we're an increasingly smaller percentage of the actual science communication that's going on in the world. And so this issue of trust becomes really complicated because, the public mistrusts a lot of people that I think we in this room probably think that they should be trusting, and trust a lot of people who we feel that they should not be trusting. So I don't have the answer. I'm one of a lot of people who's exploring it, and it's a really complicated issue, and I just want to acknowledge that.
It's kind of a two-edged sword that we face with basic science, in that what really counts ultimately is, does this stuff make a real difference in people's lives? Is it something they can assess for themselves and see that it works or it doesn't work? And but we have such a long lag between a basic discovery and to a usable outcome that it's hard for people to connect those things. And in the meantime, you see things being put out there that are marginally helpful, if at all. You see ads for cancer drugs that are a chance for a longer life. Yeah, for 3 months and a couple $100,000 and miserable side effects, but they don't tell you that part. And so that erodes some of that trust in science that happens. And so somehow we have to be able to have people feel like they're part of the journey, that they've been at the moment of discovery and they see where we're going next, And that will help build some level of trust, that they can see regular progress as we go along if we're transparent. At least that would be my guess.
I just want to add one quick thing too, which is that I think that there's also been an idea that, I guess I just want to acknowledge that part of the trust issue has to do that with the fact that science journalism and science aren't broadly representative of society at large in many respects, be it, racial, ethnic, geographic, cultural. So I think that's a real issue. And I do think, as I said this morning, that is some place where like the changing ecosystem of communication might actually help. It complicates things a lot, obviously, but it could actually help in that respect by making this realm a lot more egalitarian and representative of the full spectrum of the public.
I actually have a question. I'm kind of interested and curious in where the trust is lost. There are these studies that show that people generically trust scientists, but they also don't trust science. So where have we lost the trust? What has happened in, everybody has these T-shirts that say, "Trust me, I'm a scientist." Right. But they have done these, these studies that basically, like assess general trustworthiness of various professions. And scientists are always way up at the top as a generic group. But then people really distrust a lot of the science. And I'm just raising that as a question. I don't actually have any deep thoughts on it. But I think it's kind of fundamental to some of these conversations.
I'll just make an annoying point about the semantics of the question, but I think if we think about this more broadly, maybe it's helpful to us. The question was, how do you make them trust your science communication? Is that the appropriate question? Notice make them. How do you make them trust? What's going on there, right? And isn't a better question, how do you earn their trust? And then to tie that back into the whole conversation of the day, we're talking about ratcheting up the sophistication and the quality of our engagement efforts. And we're talking about that because ultimately we realize that it's a complex playing field out there. And it is about earning trust and earning relatability, especially now in the media environment that we exist in, where one need not expose themselves to any sort of point of view that does not reinforce their worldviews, right? And so I'm just blathering on. I think I've made my point about semantics.
I guess I am not sure that the public actually has lost trust in science. So I think a lot of where we see this really problematic interpretation of science is in, particular fields like climate change, and that data on, the public trusts scientists as a group more than the clergy, more than the military. It's literally like scientists are the most trusted people when you rank institutions in American public life, except for climate scientists. And there's a lot of things that are happening there. One is that there's particular industries that have made a concerted effort to undermine trust in climate scientists. So, that's a factor. But even if you look at the way that people who are skeptical about climate science talk about it, you can see that they don't actually distrust science itself, because when people argue against climate science, they marshal data to back up their assertions. It's just that their interpretations of the data are not the ones that climate scientists, would themselves be making. So I'm not sure that the public does mistrust science. Up till now, funding for NIH has always been really bipartisan. The people from both parties have always supported it. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
One of the great things about the growing diversity, even though it's way behind still in science, is that it's no longer feeling so much like a priesthood. And I think that was actually some of the issue, was the science became the new priesthood in a way, with the mysteries and the hidden panels and all that kind of stuff. And people resent that, I think. And I think now we're seeing more and more people of different types engaging. I think that's, the more we do that, the better it gets.
There's really interesting work that's done on trust relative to scientists, and this particular way of measuring trust, and there's different ways of doing it, but focuses on this kind of notion of expertise and credibility as being one dimension of trust and the other being warmth. Scientists enjoy a great amount of trust when it comes to credibility. They enjoy pitiful trust when it comes to warmth. And so that's a really big part, I think, of this issue of trust when we talk about it. And this is a good thing, right? Because we're talking about ways to increase and communicate more effectively and increase relatability. That particular focus on trust would argue that this is really good time, or time well spent.
So we have a few minutes left. Are there other things that the panel would like to engage each other about on this topic?
I'll just touch on this trust issue again. There are going to be people who are not going to trust us, no matter what we say. And we could give it every ounce of effort, throw lots of money into it, and it's not going to change anything. A lot of these folks are influenced by people who are family or friends, and maybe those people are the ones that are kind of sitting on the fence, the ones in the middle, that audience that would be receptive. So I think we just need to be very careful when we talk about, changing things. Who are we trying to change, and how are we trying to change them? They're gonna look at a scientist and say, whatever. There's a million reasons why that person is saying that to me, but they may, hear from their pastor, or they may hear from their brother-in-law, or get some news article or something and go, hey, Bob said that's the way things really are. Let me take a look at this, and then there's some credibility there. So I think looking at some unique ways that we might be able to get to people where we don't necessarily have to say, hey, you're wrong, but how can we go through those people who are willing and open to listening to reason and listening to the rationale, to get to the people who are a little more hardcore.
I want to come back to a little bit to Erica's point about the whether or not the public, this generic amorphous blob of the public, whether they mistrust science. And maybe that's actually not really the right way of framing that. Maybe it's actually that people are adopting their own science, or their own set of beliefs that have a sort of pseudoscientific atmosphere about them. I'm thinking about obviously the issue of vaccinations, but also the issue of genetically modified food, and vast swaths of people now completely believe that GMO foods are uniformly bad for you. And, it's become this big marketing thing on food packaging. And people who you think should know better really believe this. And they've adopted their own science, and there's no science behind their science. So I wonder how do we address that question? Maybe it isn't really a lack of trust in science. It's a willingness to adopt this belief system that is parallel to science.
So I think go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think GMOs is a really interesting situation, and like you were saying, it has to do with incentives that individuals have to care about these issues. So the way, for instance, that the GMO issue has been framed to the public, it's not about their health or safety or making food taste better or anything like that. It's about, basically enabling farmers to be able to more effectively spray pesticides on their crops. And that's not really something that I, as a member of the public, it doesn't touch my life. Why should I support that? So I think that's an issue that has suffered from the way that has been framed kind of from the beginning. So I think it goes to this, again, that question of incentives.
We moved a little away from incentives until we got back to it. I just wonder if any of the other participants have any personal stories about their own incentives or their own segment of the biomedical landscape, the incentives there that we haven't touched on and you'd like to say anything about. Yeah.
Just a comment. I've spent my life in an academic setting, and there the reward system is based on what's called the three-legged stool: research, teaching, and outreach to the community. We have a lot of training in research, essentially no training in teaching, and zero in outreach. You look at how the reward system works, it's research, teaching, just don't embarrass yourself, and outreach, zero. Yet what's the advertisement to the world is faculty are evaluated on the basis of teaching, research, and outreach. It's a big lie. It just simply is not true. But I think that if we were to be honest and follow the rules and regulations that we tell the world we follow, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because everyone would have training in teaching and outreach, which are really vitally important components of what we do. How do we do that? How do we accomplish that?
Hi, I'm Sarah from Nature. Just wanted to add on to what Erica was saying, which is a really good point about whether or not there actually is a loss of trust in science in this country. And I think that we as science communicators and scientists kind of we live and breathe science every day, and we tend to think of it as like the most important thing that everyone should trust it, and if you don't trust it, then you're anti-science. And I think that a lot of people could do with thinking out. I struggle with this too, of course, but trying to think outside of this, like there are other interests when you're talking about the general public. Business is a real factor. Religion is a real factor. And if we try and just kind of keep that in mind, we can try and keep that in mind a little bit better before we make statements like there's a war on science.
And I've got a lot of thoughts in regard to science communication and incentivization, but they make up about half of what I have to say on the next panel, so I'll just tease that here.
Okay, so we are, I think, getting ready to break for lunch. I'm going to turn this over to Yvette, who will lead us through the logistics. Before I do, I just want to say that, again, to thank the panel members, and but also I just want to give a special shout out to Yvette, who has handled all of these details and so beautifully. So thank you, Yvette.